uh, the air quality index is designed more for whether someone who's deciding whether to go on a jog today, not someone who is deciding what level of respiratory protection they need for working outdoors in smoke. So some of the messaging for that you will see with the air quality index doesn't directly apply to this context. On the right side of here, I have a graphic that kind of compares the PM 2.5 different thresholds going from lowest concentration at the bottom to the highest amounts of smoke at the top, and the correlated air quality index and their messages. So the air quality index has messages going from good, moderate, unhealthy for sensitive groups, unhealthy, all the way up to hazardous. And I mentioned that the messaging is designed for the public, not occupational health. Primarily, I think the most obvious place where there's a discrepancy is this orange category, the unhealthy for sensitive groups. A lot of times sensitive groups are kind of considered to be someone with pre-existing health conditions, children or people who are older, things like that. In this case, outdoor workers would also be considered a sensitive group, just because they are not necessarily from pre-existing health conditions, but just because they have a higher exposure than the air quality index was assuming. So just from working outside, essentially, outdoor workers are more susceptible to health effects from wildfire smoke than would be otherwise. So where the PM 2.5, we have that hour average, the air quality index uses what they call the nowcast. And that is basically averaging, instead of over the last hour, it averages over the last 3 to 12 hours. So if you were looking at PM 2.5 and the AQI, they're not going to match because they are using different calculations, but they typically get around the same result if you kind of look at more of a long-term thing. So using the nowcast AQI specifically for PM 2.5 is permitted by the rules as an approximation of the current PM 2.5. And this is also to kind of point out, there's also the 24-hour average AQI. So that 24-hour average AQI would not be able to be used for this rule. You don't actually know that until the next day. And if the stuff with the AQI wasn't confusing enough, then we also have to deal with the AQI was recently updated, which there were some benefits of this. So the EPA updated the AQI breakpoints May of this year, and they were lowering some of their thresholds to be more in line with the information and our understanding of the health effects of wildfire smoke. This chart here kind of looks at the old AQI versus the new AQI, and the main changes you can see there is the hazardous and very unhealthy category were lowered, and the AQI used to end at 500, but now they removed the cap. So the AQI, the hazardous category, just continues up. So the AQI values that are printed in the current rule are from the old AQI. We do have on our website and in a few other places, we have the updated AQI values for anyone who is using the AQI to determine the wildfire smoke concentration. The actual PM 2.5 values in the rule are not changing. So even though it looks like by the AQI values changing that the rule is, our requirements are changing, that's not actually the case. The rule, all the thresholds are at the same, it's just the AQI has shifted behind those. And this little bit is a little bit outdated. So our rule update was expected in July or August, but there was some delays with putting those updated values out in the rulemaking, but I expect those should be out somewhat shortly. In the meantime, we have provided basically employers can use either the old or the new AQI values, and they'll both be in compliance. So now kind of getting at, we've had a lot of numbers thrown out here, and I wanted to have something at least that you can sort of use to visualize what these might look like. So this photo I have on the screen here is one that I took in 2018. This is in the Tacoma Tide Flats, and looking across the tide flats here, you can see the sun rising behind this fog of smoke. Normally, just below the sun, you would be able to see the Cascade Mountain Range, possibly Mount Rainier back there. But on this day, the smoke was a little bit less than the unhealthy category. So this would still be in the unhealthy for sensitive groups. But you can kind of see a pretty high level of smoke there. I do just want to point out that visually, it won't look the same every day. So sometimes it might look pretty clear, even though there's elevated levels of smoke. Others, it could look very, very bad, even though we might be at lower levels. So relying on visual indicators isn't a good way of measuring smoke. This is more just kind of like a general idea. Right now, most of the state has some levels of smoke. Some of them are lower to the ground and others can be higher. So that's the other thing, smoke occurs at different altitudes. So it might look very smoky one day, but at ground level, it could be clear, and the other way around as well. So that's kind of why I just wanted to point out this is a useful visual indication, but don't rely on visuals alone because they can be a little bit misleading. It's really, and I'm going to be talking about how you can measure the smoke coming up. And this is one other example. This is from 2020 in San Francisco, from the San Francisco Chronicle. I don't know the specifics about exactly what concentration it was at this time, but I do know that this area around the time the picture was taken never got above 250 micrograms. So this was somewhere around the purple, very unhealthy range. So now we can kind of finally get into the actual requirements of the rule. So the scope of this rule applies to all workplaces with several exceptions. So first is workers inside enclosed buildings where the doors and windows are kept closed as much as possible. And similarly, work inside enclosed vehicles where the doors and windows are kept closed as much as possible. So if you can stay inside those, then you are exempt from the rule. So anyone who works indoors, just making sure that you keep those doors and windows closed. Buildings are not necessarily designed for keeping smoke out. So although it's not required by this rule, it's strongly recommended to have some sort of filtering system, whether it's checking your HVAC system for how well it can filter out smoke, or having additional HEPA filters just to decrease the amount of smoke in the buildings. Again, that's not required, but that definitely will increase comfort and health inside buildings. Firefighters are exempt from this rule, and also workers while they're performing prescribed burns are exempt from this rule. So I've alluded to this throughout the talk, but now I'm kind of getting at like how this rule is put together. There are different thresholds throughout the rule that influence what requirements are in place. So this chart here kind of has a summary of where those thresholds lie. So you can see we go all the way from the lowest, which is 20.5 micrograms per meter cubed, all the way up to these highest levels where we have required use of respirator. So as the concentration of smoke increases, the requirements increase as well. And one other thing I want to mention too, this is for workers who are working outside. So we do have many employers who will say they will work outside up to a certain smoke level, and then they move work indoors. So any of these higher requirements, they're not necessarily mandatory. They're only mandatory for if you continue to work outside in these conditions. So the first thing I want to talk about is exposure symptom response, and I'll kind of get at this as we go forward, but the wildfire smoke rule does have requirements in place and protections to try to reduce exposure to smoke by workers. But the requirements on this rule aren't enough by themselves to really fully remove the risk of having health effects for wildfire smoke. So there is this high level requirement for employers need to allow workers to seek medical attention or to follow medical advice they've been given regardless of the smoke concentrations. So, and this is even below that 20.5 if smoke affects everyone in different ways. So if someone is experiencing symptoms or if they've received medical advice about how they should be working in smoke, that must be permitted in the workplace. Additionally, anyone who is displaying symptoms, the employer needs to monitor them and take steps to reduce or eliminate continued exposure. So as people are developing symptoms, additional steps beyond the minimum requirements of the rule might be needed to reduce or eliminate their exposure. And where the current PM 2.5 is 250.5 micrograms per meter cubed, so this is into the hazardous category, the employer needs to move anyone who's displaying symptoms requiring immediate medical attention to clean air. So the rule goes into details, a little bit more details of what those symptoms would be. But a good example is like chest pain or asthma attacks or something like that. So at this level, they need to be provided clean air while they wait or seek medical attention instead of having to wait out in the smoke. So now this next section is exposure control. So these are things besides personal protective equipment that can be used to reduce or eliminate smoke exposure. So at the first threshold, that 20.5 micrograms per meter cubed, the employer is encouraged but not required to implement exposure controls. So this level is a point where we wanted to flag this as people will be starting to experience health consequences from wildfire smoke at these lower levels, even though it wasn't at a point where the some employers would have it feasible to start doing these. We did want to kind of mark this as like, this is a good place to start putting things, even if it's not required. Once we get to that 35.5 micrograms level, so this is when we hit that unhealthy for sensitive groups in the AQI. The employers are required to implement effective exposure controls whenever feasible. So this could change as the exposure increases beyond this, but the rule provides like a list of potential options that can help, that are known to help reduce exposures. So whatever the employer is able to do, whatever is feasible, would be required. So that could include moving work indoors. And as I said, that could be to the point where the work is now out of the scope of the rule. So if you have work that doesn't need to be done outdoors, then moving it indoors would be helpful. And again, providing additional portable filters. Some indoor work doesn't actually meet the scope, the definition of the exemption, but still moving work indoors, especially with portable HEPA filters, can help reduce exposure, even if it doesn't get you out of the scope of the rule. And then another good option is relocating or rescheduling the work to when there's better air quality. And when we get into measuring the smoke levels, I can talk a little bit more about how to do that. But again, if it's smoky today and you're not expecting it to be smoky tomorrow, maybe just save the outdoor work till tomorrow if possible. Or if you have multiple locations and one of them's impacted by smoke, but the other isn't. That's probably less likely to happen, but it's still possible, especially if the smoke is coming from a fire that's nearby. Sometimes moving out of the way of the smoke can be an option. And in any other case, if you do have to work outside, avoiding or reducing work that generates additional fumes, dust, or smoke. So for example, welding on a smoky day, you're kind of just adding additional exposures on top of that, trying to keep dust down as much as possible, and just reducing the work intensity and providing additional rest periods. Oftentimes, wildfire smoke comes at the same time as heat. So those mandatory rest periods or the preventative cool down rest periods are beneficial for wildfire smoke. Reducing the amount of work, the amount of load that the person is doing will just help reduce their breathing rate and keep them from being exposed, breathing in as much smoke as possible. So for work that still, again, does have to be done outside, on top of the exposure controls, there's requirements for respiratory protection. So just like we had on the previous one, at this 20.5 microgram level, which is somewhere in the middle of the moderate category, we are encouraging employers to provide respirators to anyone who requests it. Even if you don't provide respirators, we just note that employees can provide and use their own respirators at this threshold. So again, at these lower levels, the requirements are lower, but we do just kind of want to note that we do see health effects. We see emergency room visits even at these lower levels. So when it is 20.5 micrograms, we're based on historical data, that is almost always from wildfire smoke, and those do have health consequences even at lower levels. Similarly, once we get to this 35.5 level, so this is that unhealthy for sensitive groups, this is where now the employer is required to provide N95 filtering face piece respirators to all exposed employees, and they're required to encourage respirator use by the employees. So workers are not required to wear respirators. They can choose whether they wear the respirator or not, but as an employer, your responsibility is to make sure you provide those, make those available to anyone who wants it, and to encourage the use of the respirators at this level. And once we get up to this, just beyond the hazardous category, we bump up the requirement a little bit. And that is where now instead of just making the respirators available, the respirators must be directly distributed to each worker. So the difference is at that lower level, you can say, hey, there's respirators available when you show up to work, for example, or at the shop, grab one if you want one. Once you get to this higher threshold, it's no longer grab one if you want one. It is everyone is provided a respirator. Employees can still choose whether to wear them, but they will be provided those respirators. Essentially, it's just trying to reduce the barriers to reducing the exposure as much as possible. At these higher levels, it's pretty extreme outside. So the hope is that everyone would be choosing to wear them. And at the very least, they would have the option. Once we get to this next level, this is extremely high levels of smoke at 500.4 micrograms or more. Employees must be enrolled in a complete respiratory protection program. So this is a required use respirator program. So the employer needs to provide and require to be worn an N95 filtering face piece respirator or some other respirator that's as effective as that. This also includes fit testing, mandatory medical evaluations, and all of that. So if you are planning on continuing to work, even if you reach these levels, you need to plan ahead and make sure that your workers are enrolled in a respiratory protection program that meets the requirements of our respirator rule. For anyone who's not enrolled in that, they can't work outside of this level. And the next threshold is 555. So this is even higher than the previous one. And this is where now those N95 respirators aren't going to cut it anymore. And now a more protective respirator with an assigned protection factor of 25 or more, such as the full face respirator shown here, or my favorite, which is a powered air purifying respirator. Those are now required. And again, this is essentially at these extremely high levels. The intention is that hopefully nobody will be outside except for those who really absolutely have to be for whatever reason. But this is just, these are the kind of levels where you have like evacuations happening. So this is not really a business as usual situation. So I have this chart here, which I want to kind of get at what people will actually be experiencing at these different thresholds. So there's a lot going on here, but I'm going to break it down. So starting in this first column, this is those same PM 2.5 thresholds that you've been seeing throughout the presentation, and their associated AQI values in the next one. And the color of these AQI is associated with the colors you're seeing on the rest of this chart. So each of these columns is a different type of respirator. And earlier on these slides, I mentioned the assigned protection factor. So a N95 or a half-face respirator have an assigned protection factor of 10. That means they're expected to reduce the exposure by 10 times. And then at that other one, we have require respirators with an APF of 25 or more. So that would be all of these three over here. But this first one here, you see it doesn't have an assigned protection factor. This is an unfit tested N95. So this is what people will be wearing under those voluntary use requirements unless they're provided a fit test. And the whole point of this chart is to show that these are the exposures inside the respirator. So a voluntary use respirator isn't really expected to reduce your exposures down to a healthy level. Maybe you can kind of expect them to cut the exposures approximately in half, but it really varies depending on the situation. So if someone has a beard, for example, and they put this on top of it, they're going to be getting almost no protection from that respirator, which is why the training does recommend shaving. But again, kind of the whole point here is that people are going to be having elevated exposures if they don't have a fit test under their N95. And the main takeaway from here is that we can't really expect people to just throw on a respirator and now all of a sudden they can go back to business as usual. That's where those other exposure controls are in place, trying to reduce the exposure further. Once we get to the required use where we have fit testing, you can see those N95s do help a lot more, but they start to fall apart and you're getting unhealthy levels of air inside at these higher levels, which is why we require the bump up to these higher protections. So I know there's kind of a lot going on here. The main takeaway here again is that just putting on an N95 isn't going to solve all your problems. You need to additionally be reducing exposures beyond that. If you're trying to keep from having health effects, you're still going to have unhealthy levels of air inside the respirator. And whenever possible, providing fit tests to employees really makes a huge difference in how much exposure they're going to be getting. And I do have a lot of questions about for multiple reasons, but anyone who is wanting to go beyond the minimum requirements. So I put this slide together as an example of things that employers can consider when they're making their own program that goes beyond the minimum requirements. So this is my examples of of personal protective equipment that would be needed to keep exposures below that unhealthy level. And again, these are not necessarily something that that you would have to do every part of this, but considering where you want to work outside and at the highest levels that you would be expected to work outside, what would be required. So for example, if you're wanting to work all the way up until the exposure gets to the hazardous level, the recommendation would be to require a half-face P100 respirator. If you're going to be wanting to work up through the unhealthy level, requiring N95s. And again, that requirement would be like everyone has to wear it, and fit tests are made available. Down at these lower levels, I'm recommending fit tests on request, because again, those fit tests makes a huge difference. And always recommending providing N95s down at these lower levels. So again, these aren't requirements, but it's something to consider when you're developing your own wildfire smoke response plan. The actual minimum requirements are extremely high, and people are going to be getting exposed. So going beyond the minimum requirements is definitely highly recommended to increase basically people's ability to continue to do the work in these conditions. These high levels of smoke are also pretty rare when we're looking at the total amount of time in the year. So most of the time this won't be required, but having preparation in advance for when you do hit this will keep your work from being disrupted when you do find these. So having, for example, either respirators or these like loose fitting powered air purifying respirators available can just mean you can continue to work without disruption when the smoke does peak. So the last thing I want to go over before we open up for questions is how you can actually measure what threshold we're at. So there is a requirement for employers to determine the current PM 2.5 for the work sites that they have that are covered by the rule. And there's a couple of different tools available. So they can check the current PM 2.5 and forecasts from approved sources. So we have a list of sources that are known to be good data sources. Also, in some situations, especially if you're not close to those public sources of data, or you might just want to get more localized measurements, employers can do their own monitoring with direct read PM 2.5 sensors. And we do have a section in the rule that gives you some guidance on how you can select sensors if you want to do your own monitoring. And we'll kind of go over these different maps, but I just want to note that employers can use data from the nearest regulatory monitor. Depending on your locations, you might be very close to a monitor, or you might be further away, but you are able to use the closest, even if it is some distance away from you. And here is some common public data source. And actually, right now, this LNI PM 2.5 monitoring map, unfortunately, is offline. This is kind of a beta test, and there were some issues with it that had to be taken down for the time being. But LNI is hoping to be putting that back up in the future, where the nice thing about that is it tells you exactly what rule requirements are in place without having to kind of cross-reference with the rule. But the Ecology Air Monitoring Network is probably the biggest one. The Washington Smoke blog has great additional detailed information if you want to better understand what's going on. And the EPA Fire and Smoke Map is useful, but it only has the AQI and has limited additional features. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of Department of Ecology's air quality map and how you can use it. So this is the default view that you would see. The colors on these dots, each of these is one of the monitors that you could use. And again, like I said, some of these places, there is some space between them. But if you are in these places that you're kind of far, again, you can always use the nearest monitor. And ecology is working on adding more data sources to this map. But as the color dots on the map correlate to what air quality index there is. I am going to actually show you what happens when you click on this little color palette here. You get this second view. And this is just a different color scheme that helps for those with color vision deficiencies. So this is what I'm going to be using for the rest of the time talking about this, just so make sure that everyone's able to actually see what's going on here. But from this map, you can either click on individual locations. You can take kind of a higher level using these options to sort and filter. And one other thing I think it's useful to know is that if you click on these, like I said, the air quality index could be measuring any one of these different contaminants. Usually during wildfire smoke, it is PM 2.5, but if you just click on this, it filters and only shows data from PM 2.5, just so you make it sure you're actually looking at smoke. And this is what you would see if you actually select one of these sites here. It shows you what the data has been for the last several hours. So you can see how it's changing. And then from here, you can click on site info to get more information specific to the site. That will give you the current PM 2.5 as well there. And this reports helps you get to additional information on historical levels of data. And if you go to more layers here, it'll pull up this, and selecting the smoke forecast. This is where you can get the smoke forecast, which is really helpful for planning purposes. So during the smoke season, they have a 5-day forecast, and you can click through the different days and it will show this overlay on the map with an estimate of what AQI they would expect that you could be reaching for that day. It's not perfect, so use this kind of as a high-level tool for assisting with planning, but it's not a replacement for actually checking the current, because the conditions are pretty volatile. As good as their forecasting has got, wildfire smoke and wildfires in general are extremely unpredictable, and things can change pretty quickly. So this is useful for knowing whether you need to get N95s to certain work locations in preparation, or, for example, in this situation, like maybe if you're in this area, you don't have to think about it quite as much, but still it's useful to kind of expect the unexpected when it comes to smoke. So that is all I have for today. And if anyone here has any questions, I'd be happy to answer in the time we have left.
Well, Chris, I just want to thank you again for joining Washington State Tree Fruit Association and presenting for our group this afternoon. I feel like as I look out and see the smoky air, it's a perfect topic for today. Again, a last call out. Do we have any questions? Feel free to take yourself off mute and or type the questions within the chat.
Yeah, and while we have that time, I'm just gonna pull this up. This is the actual live map for right now. And I think I also mentioned the Washington Smoke blog. So I didn't actually go into that. So I kind of want to show that because that has some really useful information and that can be helpful in planning. So this is the Washington Smoke blog. They do have this map as well. These additional data sources you see in the little small squares, those are actual public monitors. So that could be something that someone has at their home. those can be useful information, but those aren't something that you could be using for compliance with the rule, just to kind of keep that in mind. But down here, if you go to the actual blog, they talk about where the smoke is coming from, they have more details on what the forecasts are, satellite images and things like that. So this is linked in the rule itself. But again, especially if you have, for planning purposes, having a broader understanding of what's going on can be really useful in knowing what to expect. But a simplified approach, again, is just to look at the smoke forecast, and you can see kind of what we are expecting in the next couple of days, which can be helpful. Which, good news is, it looks like things are expected to be clearing out at least somewhat and over the next weekend.
That's great news and excellent tools.
Yeah.
So in the chat, John Devaney has asked Chris, if anyone has any questions about implementation, should they contact your team or work with the LNI consultations team?
Yeah, working with consultation is really useful because they can come and actually look at your specific written programs, your training programs, and your smoke response plan, and they can give you kind of more tailored advice. If you have more technical questions about like specifics in the rule, that would be a good place to contact me. So I think the main differentiating factor about whether you should contact consultations or myself is if you want just help getting these put in place and general questions about how you can implement it, consultation, they can give you really tailored advice. If you have higher level questions about what something in the rule means, or maybe how it could work, that would be a good place to reach out to me. And if you ask consultation and it's something they can't answer, they'll reach out to me for clarification anyway. So I think consultation is usually a good first step because they can give you much more tailored advice and really actually like help you dig in and get your programs in compliance.
Wonderful, thank you. It looks like we don't have any further questions in the chat. Chris, again, I just want to thank you so much for this. Oh, one more question. So Maria Carrillo asks, for written heat exposure safety plan, where would this need to be posted or included? Will this be like on the main bulletin board in the orchards or more like included in the hiring packet?
Yeah, so for both the heat and the smoke safety plans, this would be similar to how you have your accident prevention program or your HAZCOM program. So these are your written programs that are available to employees, but they don't necessarily need to be posted on site. So employees need to be aware of them. They need to be available, but they don't necessarily need to be posted. The training for both of these, which I don't think I really got into that. So for heat, that training needs to be done annually. Wildfire smoke as well, the training needs to be done annually. The main thing for wildfire smoke is you need to provide the training before workers are exposed to that first threshold, that 20.5 micrograms per meter cubed. So if anyone comes on and they don't have that training yet, and you have elevated smoke levels, they can't work outside until after they've received that training. So those two trainings are designed to work well together. So most people, they're doing both these trainings at the beginning of the year, sometime like April or something, before it gets hot and smoky, and then just repeating it every year. Anyone who comes on, hires on in the meantime, they would just need to be trained before they get out there and working in those conditions.
Great. I was just giving it a couple more seconds here to see if anybody else typed in any additional questions.
And while you have that little bit extra time, I've kind of talked about these resources, but I'm going to share my screen one more time. If you just do a search for LNI wildfire smoke, this will typically be the first page. And this is also from the LNI website under safety and health. You can go to the topics. So this wildfire smoke topic page is the main place where you can find information. Here's information about the rule update that's happening right now, and here's where you can actually get to the specific rules. So there's two versions. There's the general rule, and then there's the rules for agriculture. They're almost identical. There's just some internal references that are different, but the requirements themselves are the same. Just use whatever rule applies to your place. And then coming down here, there's some like high level information. One tool that will probably be useful is this requirements and policies tab. This is where you can see the new air quality index values that with a summary of like what's required at those different values. So this is kind of a little bit more detailed than what I covered here, but less than the rule itself, kind of just to give you hopefully a high level understanding. And this training and resources tab, this is a good place to look for to get a training template. I'm sorry, this is the response plan template. So this is that written program that you're asking about. And here's the training kit down here. We have those in English and Spanish, and then also online versions. And we also have our Heat Smart page as well, which you can find on the LNI website, and that has the same thing with those written program templates.
So we have a question, how will we receive the recording? Maria, I will be uploading the recording to the Washington State Tree Fruit Association website, and that will be published next week. And that covered my last topic, to let everyone know that would be published and uploaded. So if people need a reference, your guide to navigating the different sites and being able to find the resources that you covered on this site or during this call, then they'll be able to do that on the Tree Fruit Association's website. So it doesn't look like we have any additional questions. Chris, I just want to thank you again for taking time out of your day to present to us. This is great information, extremely valuable, especially in our current state with fires that seem to be surrounding us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I always appreciate the chance to talk about this. I know a lot of this stuff seems pretty complicated at first. Once you kind of wrap your mind around it, it does get easier. And but yeah, I definitely want to recognize that this is a challenge. As I mentioned before, consultation is definitely strongly recommended if you're wanting to either having trouble getting this stuff set up or just you have something set up and you want a second set of eyes to make sure that you got everything set up correctly. They're a great resource. And again, if there's something that they can't answer, they will definitely check in with me. I'm talking to them all the time about this sort of stuff.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like that is going to conclude our call for the day. Wishing everybody a great rest of your Friday and a wonderful weekend. And again, this will be published in the next few days on the Tree Fruit Association's website.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.